Okay. Hi, everyone, and welcome. My name is Jane Hauser. I am the Director of Marketing and Outreach at NESCA. And thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for our webinar, Early Signs of Reading Challenges. Our host today is NESCA's Pediatric Neuropsychologist, Dr. Alissa Talamo. And I just want to go over a couple of quick housekeeping items for you. If you could possibly just use the chat function down at the bottom in case you're having any technical difficulties or challenges with the webinar itself. We will be having a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. So either hold your questions till the end or go ahead and type them in the Q&A section and we will hold them over till the end of the presentation. And we will be doing a poll, one quick poll question for you. If you could take the time to answer that. And then with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Talamo. Thank you.
Thank you, Jane. So my name is Alissa Talamo, and I'm a neuropsychologist here at NESCA. Let me tell you a little bit about, first of all, I'm happy to be here today to do this webinar. And I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I'm the mom of a high school senior, a girl, so I'm in the boat of remote learning with everybody else, so I feel it. And just to let you know a little bit about myself, I earned my doctorate in clinical health psychology from Furkhoff Graduate School in part of Albert Einstein School of Medicine in New York. And prior to coming to NESCA, I worked for many years as a child and adolescent clinical therapist. And then I decided to re-specialize in neuropsychology, and I came to work with Dr. Helmus at what was called then the Children's Evaluation Center, and I did a 2-year postdoctoral training with her. And then I've been with NESCA since it was created by Dr. Helmus in 2007. So I've really enjoyed working in this field. It's certainly a better fit for me personally than the therapy piece. And I specialize now in working with children and adolescents who have language-based learning disabilities, including dyslexia, attentional disorders, emotional issues, and I also enjoy working with highly gifted students. So that's a little about me. So now I'm going to talk to you a little bit about early warning signs of reading challenges. So,
and Alissa, if I could just interrupt, just to let you know the results of the poll, sure. We have 33% of our audience in the preschool category, 56% in the elementary, and 11% each in middle school and high school. So we have a good broad swath of folks here.
Great, excellent. So hopefully I'll have enough time to touch on all of those areas. The beginning is going to be more about the early signs, but I'll also talk about what are some of the expectations that you would expect when a child is in an upper grade. But the first thing I wanted to say was, why is my, excuse me, I'm having a little moment of screen sharing issues. Slideshow from beginning. There we go, let's see if this works. Yes, so, sorry about that. Technology is not my friend. So the first thing I want you to know is that reading, our brains are not wired for reading when we are born. Think about when your child is born, they are wired to automatically know how to feed, and then they are wired to learn how to talk and to walk and all of those things. But reading is a man-made it's a man-made process. And so a child needs to be explicitly taught to read. Some children need only a little bit. They can take it in and just see it and practice it and learn it. But most children need some explicit instruction learning how to read. And that's because it's not a natural developmental process. So some areas that can be sign of indicators for some potential early reading difficulties are a history of chronic ear infections. Children who are slow to learn to speak are at risk for reading problems. Difficulty with rhyming is very common. Word retrieval difficulties. So a lot of, I can't find my thing or the stuff or the place rather than the actual name of the item. And then a family history of reading problems. I don't know why, there we go. I skipped one, sorry. Skipped a few here. I'm so sorry, hold on. So, here we go. There are certain things that a child needs as they develop in order to develop reading. So they have necessary pre-reading skills that they need to acquire before they can learn to read. And so the first one is word awareness, the idea that words are individual components. So once upon a time is not once upon a time, even though a lot of us speak very quickly and our kids probably do think that that's one word, it's not. And then the next thing they need is syllable awareness. So to be able to say upon, so they know that there's more than one sound, it can be more than one sound in a word. And then the next thing that they need to know is to understand that every word can be broken down into individual sounds. And there are 42 to 44 speech sounds in the English language. Where part of what makes reading in English difficult is there are several letters that make more than one sound, and there are several letters that make the same sound as another letter. So obviously, but that can make it complicated, but first and foremost, they need to be able to hear and to make all of those sounds. So sometimes children with articulation issues, it can make learning to read a little bit harder. Children with hearing issues, it can make reading a little bit harder. It doesn't mean that they're not going to be able to learn to read, but they'll probably need more explicit, direct instruction and specialized instruction to help them in that area. And then the last thing that they need to start to develop is what's called onset rhyme awareness. But basically all you need to know about this is that the onset would be one sound, and then the rhyme is usually a string of letters that they can recognize and quickly put together. So for cat, the k would be the onset and the at would be the rhyme. And why the rhymes are important is because if you took out the C and put in a B, they don't have to sound out b, at. They would just say b and at, and they would put them together. So recognizing those sounds is very important. And then once children begin to transition to phonics, they learn that those sounds have a letter that matches them. And they learn that those letter sounds can be put together to make words. And again, that onset rhyme. So I have a little video just to give you a sense of phonics. I don't know if any of you have watched this. This is the Leapfrog series. It can be a lot when your child wants to watch it for the 500th time. However, it's a very good way of introducing your child to phonics. So here's an example.
The A says ah, the A says ah, every letter makes a sound. The A says ah, and the B says ah, the B says ah, every letter makes a sound. The B says ah, the C.
So you get the idea of that. So here are some pre-reading skills that you would hope to see when your child is 2 or 3. They pretend to read, they retell a story that you've read to them previously by looking at the pages and the pictures, and they start to name letters of the alphabet. And then, so those are some pre-reading skills that you would need, or those are some pre-reading activities that you would hope that your child's starting to develop around 3 or 4. And then other signs are literally recognizing signs, playing with books, playing with pencils, playing with paper. If you can have these things around, then that's going to encourage your child actually in the area of reading as well. And the funny story about these signs is they'll recognize signs, but they might not recognize them correctly or might not read them correctly when they first start. So when I was younger and we were driving to my grandmother's house down 128, and all of a sudden my little brother screams, "Stop the car!" And my dad slams on the brakes. We almost died. Turns around, he's like, "What is it?" And my brother's like, the frogs are gonna die. And my dad's like, "What are you talking about?" He said, "It's a frog area." No, it was a fog area. So just to give you a sense, but he was trying to read, so that was a good start on his part. And some other early indicators of potential difficulties are trouble learning nursery rhymes. So the Jack and Jill, the Little Miss Muffet, all of those things, because if they're not recognizing the rhyming, that's a sign that they may not be hearing the sounds in the words. Obviously, difficulty learning and remembering the names of letters in the alphabet. Another one that is a telltale sign is when your child is not able to recognize letters in their own name. So if they're going to preschool every day and the teacher is writing their name at the top of a page, and their name is Sarah, and if you ask them to identify an S and they don't recognize that that's the S or that that's the letter in their name, that can be a sign that they're not picking up particularly letters that have been presented to them frequently. If they mispronounce familiar words or persist with baby talk, that's something that most kids outgrow, but as they get a little older, if they continue to mispronounce familiar words, that can be a sign. And as I was saying before, not recognizing rhyming patterns like cat, bat, rat, and that family history of reading or spelling difficulties, because dyslexia often does run in families. So those are some of the underlying reading skills that they need. Then they move into kindergarten and they're learning to identify the letters, to match the letters to the sounds. They're learning about how letters and sounds can go together to form words. They're also learning how to write the alphabet, both capital and lowercase. That doesn't mean that they're going to be able to do all this consistently, but they're starting to learn these skills. And this last piece here, that most kindergarten children are expected to read words by the end of the school year, that's the expectation around this area, but that's not the developmental reality of many children. Many children are not developmentally ready, or it's not developmentally appropriate for them at that time to be reading by the end of kindergarten. So if your child's not reading in kindergarten, it doesn't mean you need to panic. It means you need to pay attention, because they've probably been given quite a bit of phonics instruction at school. You're probably reading to them a lot at home, but still, there are many children who don't read until a little bit later. My daughter's an example. She didn't read until, I want to say, mid-first grade, and now she's a senior in high school and she's doing great. And she didn't have a learning challenge with reading. She just wasn't a kid who developed it early. And certainly, I know there's a lot of pressure that the expectation is that your child will be reading by the end of the school year in kindergarten, but that's not necessarily a sign of dyslexia per se. If they're not, it's definitely something to keep an eye on and to think about just monitoring their development, but it certainly doesn't mean that they're going to have a reading disability going forward. And I just wanted to speak on that because I feel like there is a lot of expectation for kids to be reading at the end of kindergarten, and it's not necessarily a sign of what's going to develop into a full-blown reading disorder. So by the end of kindergarten, your child should be able to write their first and last name, write many, but not all of the letters dictated to them. Some letter reversals are normal for this age, and they should be able to recognize that sound symbol relationship. So if you show them a letter or tell them a letter, they should be able to tell you the sound that it makes, and they should be able to identify rhymes and produce rhymes. So by the end of kindergarten, those are the skills that you're looking for. And by the end of first grade, here's where they should show some independent interest in reading related activities. So even if they're not reading, they should be picking up books. They should want to listen to stories. Sometimes that's another, I don't think I put it in the slides actually, but sometimes that's another sign that a child is struggling to learn to read, is that they avoid even being read to. But often they like to be read to, but they just can't independently read. They should be able to associate letters and sounds, listen with interest to stories read to them. They should be able to retell a simple story that you've told them. And they should recognize that the spoken word and the written word have that connection. And they should have acquired a list of sight words. It's a small list, but I'll talk a little bit about that. So for example, when a first grader has good store of sight words, they can then use those words to figure out a new word. So here's a list of some sight words that are very common for first graders to learn. And if they learn the word in, for example, then they can use it to figure out chin and thin. And that's an example of that onset rhyme that I was speaking about. And first graders should be able to read a simple book smoothly, a very simple book, but generally they read word for word, or one word at a time. So when we think about, okay, now my child's in kindergarten, they're in first grade, and they're still struggling, what would be considered a struggle and what is a normal development? So reading errors that show that they're guessing is a sign that they're not even making an attempt to sound out a word. So for example, if you're showing them a book and there's a picture of a dog and they'll say puppy when they're, instead of reading the word dog, that's an example. If they're still struggling to understand how to separate a word into different sounds, or how to do syllables, or how to break those words apart, that's going to make reading obviously very challenging for them, and that's a red flag. The avoiding reading, disappearing when it's time to read, complaining that reading is very hard. I mean, those are a little bit more obvious, but still, if they can't sound out even those simple words and have those simple endings by the end of first grade, it's time to start saying, you know, are they not understanding how to break down these words into sound and how these sounds can blend together? And if they're still struggling with that sound symbol relationship. So the B says B. If they're not able, if you say what sound does the letter T make? If they can't give that example, you know, that's at the end of first grade, they should absolutely have mastered those skills. By the end of second grade, they should show more independent interest in reading. They should listen when someone's reading to them or listening to books on tape. They should be able to not only listen to the story, but if you ask them questions about the story, they should have a basic understanding. And they should recognize new words by context clues, by using their phonics. Have a basic sight vocabulary, should be a little larger, obviously, than the one that I showed you for first grade. And if you're concerned about that, the teachers have lists of sight words that they expect the children to learn by the end of first grade, by the end of second grade. You could request a copy of that and you could work on those with your child if that's an area of concern. And they should be able to spell grade level words. But I wouldn't be too concerned if in first and second grade, if your child spells cake, K-A-K-E, they at least are demonstrating the sounds and the correct sound, and the K does make that sound, even though it's not the right word, the right letter for that word. But if your child isn't able to learn and retain the basic spelling words that they're being given in second grade, then that's a red flag. And for second and third grade, the child should be able to read familiar stories, and they should become increasingly fluent in their reading. It should be less choppy. They should be able to read a sentence fluently, because they're putting together all of these pieces. They're decoding, means they're breaking down the word into the sounds, but they're also able to blend those sounds together to read the word. They have a sight vocabulary that they're able to access, and they're able to comprehend what they're reading. So one of the slides I actually took out, but I want to talk about a little bit, is the two different pieces of reading disability or dyslexia. There's this phonemic awareness, this ability to break down the word into sounds and also to put those sounds together. So for example, a test that I would do with a child would be say snail, now say snail without saying could they say sail, for example? That's a harder one, but that's just an example. Or I'll say to them, what word do these sounds make? At. Can they put that together to make cat? Or another one that I'll ask is, what's the third sound in the word cat? Can they break it up and pick out the sound? So that's one component of dyslexia. And then another piece of a reading disability can be what we call rapid naming. So as you become a strong reader, you are no longer sounding out every word that you see. You see a word, you've seen it before, you have a sight memory, you pull it out quickly. If a child is slow to pull out, even if they know it, if they're slow to pull out the word or the sound, then their reading fluency is going to suffer. So so for example, some words you can't sound out, like the. Like, if you think about it, you can't really sound that word out. So that's a sight word that they need to have. So they may have it, but if they can't rapidly pull it out, they may guess another small word to fill in just based on the context. So those are the two pieces I think that I wanted to make sure I touched on, that you understand that it's not, there's the piece obviously of the awareness of breaking down the words into sounds and putting them together, but there's also this retrieval piece that can really impact a child's reading development. So that's something to think about when you watch your child reading. Are they able to pull out those sight words? And we think as they go through a little bit more of school, by third grade, concerns would be if they're still reading in a very choppy manner, if they're very slow, if it's just not automatic in any way, if they're making wild guesses because they just cannot sound out a word they've never seen before. That would be, by third grade, they should be able to at least make an attempt to sound out a word. And particularly if they don't have any strategy on how to read a new word. This is when you start seeing children have, for example, if they know they're taking turns reading around the room in class and everybody reads a sentence and they count how many sentences and they're fifth, well, at the fourth sentence, they say, oh, I need to go to the nurse, I don't feel good. That's a sign that they're probably struggling to read. And they avoid reading out loud. They don't want other kids at this point, or even the teacher or their parents, to think that they don't know how to read. Or if they fatigue very quickly when reading because it's an effort. Oftentimes, there can be other things that cause that. For example, if a child has an attentional issue, they can fatigue when reading because they're focusing so hard on just sustaining attention to what's on the paper and staying on place that they could fatigue as well. But often, if you see it chronically over time, then it's more likely that it's just difficult for the child to access the text or read the text. So some things that also you'll see at this age, I mentioned it before, not just difficulty retrieving the word they want, but misnaming words. So volcano for tornado. Some of the ones that I look for are escalator instead of elevator, or things like that they mix them up. If they mispronounce long or unfamiliar or complicated words that they've heard before, that's not always a bad thing, because sometimes if they learn a new word by reading and it's an atypical word and they try to sound it out as best they could, that doesn't necessarily mean they have a reading disorder. I'll give you an example. When I was younger, I read an entire book and I thought the girl's name was Penelope. And I said to my mother, who would name their child Penelope? And she looked at me and said, no, it's Penelope, right? So it was just an unfamiliar word. I sounded out using my phonics and it just wasn't correct. But the idea is, so it's not every word, but if you see children tripping over words, Piscetti is cute when they're 4, it's not so cute when they're 8, right? So that's kind of I guess a way to look at it. And if they need time to process language, to respond to questions, that can be just a sign of that retrieval, that language organization piece that can set them up for difficulties with the reading and responding to questions about reading. So what you start to see is as these children get older, there are certain things that they would be expected to be able to do that they can't do. One thing that is often seen in kids with reading difficulties is difficulty with rote learning, just learning just facts that have no connection to each other. So dates, people's names, telephone numbers, a list. And so that difficulty finding those, that plays into that retrieval piece. Trouble finishing tests on time. If that's because they're a slower reader and they need time to read it and they need time to figure out how to spell the words and they're not automatic in these skills yet, you might see that. Difficulty learning a foreign language, that comes back again to that rote learning piece, because a lot of foreign language is memorizing words that are not familiar and then having to retain them and pull them out. So that when you're, oftentimes you don't see that when the children are younger because they're not being asked necessarily to learn a foreign language at the same time they're learning to read. But as they move through school, there are schools that offer a foreign language, very early on, or an immersion program or things like that. And if your child is struggling to learn the foreign language, it may have to do with that that retrieval piece and play into the reading issues can be playing into that. Poor spelling, messy handwriting. And here's where you start to see the children start to internalize their reading challenges, because they know if other children are reading more smoothly than they are or somewhat faster than they are. They don't understand that reading has nothing to do with how smart you are. That's something when I work with children, I talk a lot about, that reading is not about intelligence. It's not about how smart you are. It's just a code that we need to teach you how to crack. And once we just have to figure out the best way to teach you that. And once we do that, then you'll see that you're able to understand the stories. You're able to make good connections between ideas, but the access to the individual words has nothing to do with intelligence. But when you're in third grade and the kid next to you who still acts like a super young kid and not, I don't want to say anything, but a kid that maybe isn't can't even tie his shoes yet, let's say, but he can read better than you. Well, then you're going to start to think, well, maybe I'm not smart because Johnny can do it and I can't. I think that it's very important to help kids understand that reading is a made up system, and it's just one thing I say. For another example would be, for some kids, you can show them, you can take them to a baseball game and they can watch how the player stands and they can watch how he looks at the ball and it's the ball, and then they can go up and do that. And some kids, you need to show them how to hold the bat and where to put their feet and why they should look at the ball, and then they can hit the ball. So I think it's important to put it in a way that kids can understand that it's just the way in which they need to be taught. It's not about their level of intelligence. So one important point to make is, for every 20 minutes a day that is spent reading, the vocabulary development is huge, because when we talk, we tend to use the same words all the time. But when you are exposed to language through literature, there are always new words and different syntax and different contexts. And you can see in this slide that kids who read just develop a much more robust vocabulary. However, that doesn't mean that you can't help your child who's struggling to read to develop their vocabulary. If a child's listening to an audiobook, they're still getting that same vocabulary. If you're reading to your child a book that maybe they can't access yet on their own, they're still gaining that vocabulary. So there are ways to help them with those pieces. But it is important to also recognize that children who struggle to read tend to avoid to read. Then they are not gaining the skills, and then of course it just cycles into this I don't want to read, and it makes it very difficult to engage them. However, I will say that many of the children I work with who struggle to learn to read love to be read to, and they do love literature and they love to learn, and they're so it's not necessarily connected that they're not going to have exposure to literature or language. It's just getting them to do it on their own can be a little more challenging. So I know that a lot of parents want, obviously we have the books that are the leveled books for them, but if your child just wants to read comic books, if those comic books have words in them, I say, let them look at them. If they want to read Captain Underpants, that's fine. I'm trying to avoid books that, what's the one? I think it's Junie B. Jones, where the grammar is wrong, and there's a lot of that kind of thing. I don't know that I would push those for a kid who's struggling with language development or reading development, but certainly if they want to read Sports Illustrated for Kids, pulls in a lot of kids that wouldn't necessarily read, but maybe they want to read about their favorite player or their favorite sport. Anything you could think of that will engage the child to want to spend time looking at books or any written language can be really helpful. So there are a lot of things that you can do at home to help your child's development. Like I was saying before, choose high interest books. Read out loud to them, even if it's above their reading level. If it's something that they're going to be engaged in, again, it will show them the syntax, the grammar, all of those pieces that they can get. And also the child will probably enjoy the more sophisticated stories that they wouldn't be able to get to on their own. But when your child is younger, oftentimes they want to listen to the same books over and over and over again. This is how children learn. This is how they learn their vocabulary. This is how they learn comprehension. So another story here is when my daughter was, I want to say 3, she convinced her grandmother that she knew how to read because we had read Chicka Chicka Boom Boom so many times that not only did she know it by heart, but she knew what words were on what page. Not that she could pick out a specific word, but she knew what word was on what page. And so she would read it to her grandmother. And I was so sorry that I had to tell her grandmother that she wasn't actually reading, but that's okay. But this is how children learn. They learn through repetition, they learn through practice, they learn through familiarity. And that's why, you can listen to books over and over. And another example is when we took a family trip driving to Washington, D.C., you can listen to Mrs. Pigglewiggle 3.5 times on the way down and 3.5 times on the way back. So, and despite the fact that we had taken out all these other books on audiobook, that's what we listened to. But children enjoy that. Each time they listen to it, they recognize something new in the story. They can have a discussion about it. So all of that is really, really important. And that's how, like I said, that's how children learn. So some other things that you can do are, for young children, word patterns. Dr. Seuss books are great for rhyming, for recognizing rhymes, for learning word patterns. I believe the original Dr. Seuss book was I think it was Green Eggs and Ham. And if I remember correctly, he was basically challenged by a friend to write a book using less than, I don't remember if it was 50 different words or a small amount of words. And so he came up with Green Eggs and Ham. And so, of course, there was a lot of repetition in it, but kids love that. So that's a good example of helping with rhyming. Playing word games, clapping out sounds in words. Another game that can be fun is if you say to a child, find me something in this room that starts with a B sound. I wouldn't focus on the letter because obviously their spelling and their sound recognition aren't quite the same when they're younger, but find something that starts with a certain sound could be a fun game for kids. Doing a rhyming game, like how many words can you come up with that rhyme with bar? Doesn't even have to be a real word. How many words can they come up with? And playing that game. Take advantage of the internet. There are a lot of good free programs. So the one that I have here, Starfall, that's actually Scholastic Books puts that out. And what I like about that is, first of all, at least when my daughter was younger, it was free. I'm hoping it's still free. And what I liked about it, it was very leveled. So if your child was in first grade, but they didn't have first grade skills yet, you could get on in advance and see what level they would be at, and you could bring it up for them. They would never know that it wasn't a first grade level. It has all sorts of fun activities. It can read, if a child can't read a word, it will read it to them. It has activities for them with simple directions to build a snowman or to do all sorts of things that engages the child. Another thing to do is to have your child read some Just Right books. So a Just Right book would be being able to read a page and making fewer than 2 or 3 mistakes. You wouldn't, if they're making more than 2 or 3 mistakes on a page, then that's not a Just Right level for them. That's a little too hard for them. And then what I often tell parents when I work with kids with reading difficulties is to separate learning to read, which can be challenging for a child, and the book may be super boring because it's practicing the same onset rhyme. So it's the cat sat on the mat wearing a hat, not going to really excite your child. But if that's reading to learn how to read, and then we read for pleasure, so you read to them Harry Potter, or you read to them whatever it is that they're interested in that they might not be able to access for themselves. And to separate those out can be really helpful and important, so that they still love literature, they still want to hear stories, they still are interested in that. And I find that most kids do like that. They like to be engaged and stimulated by the material. And sometimes when they can't read it on their own at a pace that allows them to enjoy it, they get frustrated. So if they're saying, I don't want to be read to, certain ages, they go through a phase, right? First, they always want to be read to, then it's, I'm not a baby, I don't need to be read to, but then the next thing you know, they're preteen and they want to be read to again. But in the middle there, you could do audio books, you could take books out of the library that are read by the authors. The Magic Treehouse series is a great series where the author reads every book, and you can start at the beginning, which is very young, and then as your child gets older and the characters get older and the stories become more complex, those are great books to listen to. Another thing to do is when your child is practicing reading and they're reading a Just Right book is to make sure that they're following each word, pointing with their finger on the word. It makes them slow down. It makes sure they're looking at the word rather than guessing or skipping or anything like that. So that can be very helpful. And for older kids, you can ask them to tell you about what you read to them. So, or even younger kids, you can say, one thing I used to do is I would play dumb and be like, wait, I don't get it. What just happened? And then see if my child could tell me what happened on that page. See that, and for older kids, you could ask them, what do they think is the key point of the story? What's the main idea? Starting to think about that comprehension piece. So I also wanted to talk about FAPE. So just to understand that your child is entitled to a free and appropriate public education. Free, we all know what free is, right? Free doesn't cost you money. Appropriate public education, that's where, you know, what are the expectations for their age? Are they meeting those expectations? Are they able to access the curriculum? These are things that your child should be provided through their public school. Obviously, right now, in theory, you know, obviously a lot of people are remote, a lot of people are hybrid, but the school is still required to provide your child with an appropriate education. It's obviously harder for teachers, harder for students, but they're still required. So if you have concerns about your child's reading, it's never too early to advocate, it's never too late to advocate, to ask to have your child evaluated, to speak with the teacher, to check if they're checking on where they are in their reading level, relative to where they should be based on grade, and things like that. And just understanding that you have that right to ask for that, even during this time where schools are remote or hybrid. And then if you are concerned about your child's reading, like I said, it's never too early, it's never too late to ask for help. If you want a special education evaluation for your child, you have to write a physical letter or an email. You can't just ask for it. I mean, you can, but they're not necessarily mandated to act on just a verbal request. So make sure that you write your reason for your request, and then that sets into the process of an evaluation, or obtain an outside evaluation for your child. For example, a neuropsychologist who would do more than, it's just different. It's not that the school's evaluations are good or bad, or mine are good or bad. It's a neuropsychological evaluation is a little bit more comprehensive. So it will look at language processing, it will look at memory skills, it would look at the social emotional, it would look at all of the underlying reading skills, all of those pieces, plus cognitive abilities, your child's verbal skills, visual, spatial skills, all those things they need for school. So you could do either of those. Obviously, the one through school is at no cost to you. And a lot of parents like to start there, but if you're very concerned, then you might want to get a more outside in-depth evaluation. You could do, for example, with a neuropsychologist, a speech language therapist, somebody like that. And then I just had a few resources here that I think are very helpful. The International Dyslexia Association is very helpful. There's also the Massachusetts Dyslexia Association, which you can find through the IDA. Decoding Dyslexia is a wonderful, really great group who's doing a lot of lobbying and advocating for students with language-based learning disabilities. They're the ones who push through in Massachusetts the early screening for dyslexia. They have tons of information of supports and things like that. And the Massachusetts branch is particularly strong and has a lot on their website that can be very helpful. I'm terrible with time management, so I'm actually doing okay. So I wanted to leave time for questions, talk about any specifics you might have about testing, but that's my basic presentation as far as the early signs to look for and things you can do to help your child develop those skills.
Thank you, Alissa. We do have a question about if a parent or caregiver is seeing some of these signs at home, how can they get on the same page as a teacher, especially during the, a lot of kids being in the hybrid model where parents are doing some at home, but teachers are doing some at school?
So that's a really good question. And I will say that I had a lot of recent slew of intakes for parents who said, I never realized until I sat home with my child and watched how they approached a task or how they were reading when they were given something. So the things to do, I guess it depends on the grade level. I think for the younger grades, kindergarten, first grade, to talk to the teacher about what phonics are they working on in class. Are there specific books that they could be using at home to practice those specific skills? Is the teacher concerned that the child is not at the level that they should be for this age at this grade? There are a lot of screenings that teachers do that are different than what I would do in my office as far as how they're normed. But for example, they'll do a test of fluency, they'll do a test, and they'll do a test where they have children read certain paragraphs that are considered certain lexile levels. And so in first grade, they should be at level G. Well, where is my child? Are they at G? Are they at B? Because sometimes they'll say, what you don't, and it's nobody's fault, but sometimes there's a miscommunication where a teacher will say, oh no, they're making progress. Well, if they're making slow incremental progress, but not at the rate as everybody else, then they're still falling further and further behind. So if your child was at B and now they're at C, that's great. But where is everybody else? Are they at H, right? So asking those types of questions can get you a little bit more information than, oh no, he's getting there, slow, and making sure that gap just doesn't widen so much that the child is just so far behind. Because what happens is when you get into third grade, fourth grade, it shifts from learning how to read to using those reading skills to learn. And if your child is not reading at that grade level, then they're not going to be able to read the handouts or a textbook or things like, or a math word problem they might not be able to access. So those are the kind of questions you want to ask in the earlier grades.
Great, thank you. And I have another question here. Are family traits of verbal word retrieval linked to reading issues? I know you talked a little bit about, dyslexia and other reading issues being, I guess hereditary. But are there specific characteristics of reading issues also?
So it depends on where those word retrieval issues are coming from. If it's a more what we would would call in the neuropsych world executive functioning, like the words are in there, but you just didn't store them in a very effective way. And so when you go to pull them out, they just can't come out. Or anxiety can affect retrieval. So a perfect example is I'm awful with names. And if I see somebody coming and I'm like, oh my God, what's their name? What's their name? And I can't pull it out. But the second they walk away, I'm like, oh, that was Jane, right? It had nothing to do with, was it in there? It was in there. I just couldn't access it at that moment. So I guess it depends. It certainly is a sign that you see often in children with dyslexia. But if they just have word retrieval issues, I don't know that that would necessarily translate into a reading disorder unless it's a visual retrieval issue. So if they see a word, can they quickly pull it out? So one of the tests that I give, for example, it's called a rapid automatic naming test, and it will have a page of just pictures. I don't have it in the office with me, of course, but it has pictures of a dog, a star, cat, a chair, just those things in a different order over and over. How quickly can they just name those? They know what a star is, they know what a dog is, but does it take them longer to pull it out? Then that's going to suggest that when they go to read, they're going to have trouble pulling out whole words that they know, just the speed at which they can pull it out. So in that sense, it's related. But if the only issue is some word retrieval, verbal organization, that might make writing more challenging, but not necessarily reading per se.
Okay, thank you. And we have another question here. A school is unwilling to accept that our daughter has dyslexia because she's only 7 years old, even though we have done numerous tests with Boston Children's that state that she does. What should our next step be? And can you recommend any programs in Massachusetts that we could do privately with her?
So yes, so the first thing I would say is get yourself an advocate, a special ed advocate to at least give you a consult on, okay, do you need more testing? Is it, is this, I mean, it sounds like if you have from Children's a diagnosis, the schools are not required to accept the findings of an outside evaluation. They're only required to consider them. But when you have something that's been documented that shows that a child is not developing the skills at the rate they should be, the schools should be responsive to that. So if they're not, I would say find a good educational advocate who can go with you to these meetings and knows how to talk to the schools. I often say start in a friendly way, but then find somebody who not only can initially start off friendly, but can really stick by and push for what you need if the school is resistant. As far as programs, the most commonly used programs for reading disabilities, dyslexia, are what's called the Orton-Gillingham program or the Wilson Reading Program. The Wilson Reading Program is an offshoot of Orton-Gillingham. They're both structured, curriculum-based, research-based, great programs. There are a lot of private tutors. I don't know if on the NESCA website we have Orton-Gillingham or Wilson tutors listed. I know we have other like educational advocates and things like that, but certainly you could call, for example, the Carroll School, and they'll have a list of vetted tutors that you could hire privately to at least start and get your child started while you're fighting with the school to get the child the services that they need. Those are good places to start. And the Decoding Dyslexia website has a lot of information on that as well.
Right, and as Alissa mentioned, we do have a list on our referrals on our website, www.nesca-newton.com. We have a list of educational advocates and attorneys as well.
And the other thing I wanted to say is just, there's a book, and I just find this one very helpful for parents to understand dyslexia and reading issues. It's called Overcoming Dyslexia by Sally Shaywitz out of Yale. And I saw something recently, she posted a blog about, she has a new version coming out, so I'm very excited because within it, she says that she has included a lot of things that parents can do with their children to help develop some of these skills. And so in the meantime, if you want to take out the older version of the library or buy a used copy to look at, it's divided into section 1 that looks at sort of the medical brain imaging and all the differences between a dyslexic brain and a non-dyslexic brain, which is fascinating, but not for everybody. And then the second half is much more parent oriented what is dyslexia, what are the skills, what type of interventions work. Here's the research that shows it works. I mean, when I write a report for a child, I'm always quoting from that book the research that shows that it not only needs to be X type of instruction, but it needs to be consistent and frequent and it's systematic. So that's a great book. That's just one that I could think of. That's another good resource for parents.
Great. Any other questions out there? Alissa, you may just want to flip to the your contact information in case people have follow-up questions.
Sorry about that. There you go. Happy to answer any questions. So that's my direct line at work and my email.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. I think those are all the questions that we have.
Great.
Just want to, one other question actually. Sorry, just how can we book an evaluation if we are interested in actually going through the neuropsychological evaluation process?
So at NESCA, you go on the NESCA website. So Jane just said it, www.nesca-newton.com. I gotta pause there for a second. And you go into the intake section and you fill out the intake form. And what happens is, depending on what your question or referral is, so my specialty happens to be language-based learning disabilities, but obviously there are other issues that come through NESCA. So if your child, if you're concerned about autism or you're concerned about an emotional disorder or anything like that, when you fill out the intake, those questions will be asked so that we make sure we have the right clinician to provide you services. But you fill out the intake, and then the office will be in touch with you to set up appointments. We are doing in-person evaluations right now. We have, I can turn my screen so you can see our 2-room model. So the child would be in the room over there, and I'm in the room here, but we're facing each other face to face. There's just a glass wall between us, so it's completely, as best we can possibly do, COVID safe. Once the child is in their room, they can take off their mask. There's an air purifier. There's more than enough Purell to go around. And but kids really like that it's face to face. I think they're tired of doing things online. It's not this, you can't get the same information online. So we are doing in person with a 2-room method. So, and it's been very effective. I would say if your child is younger than 5, it might be a little hard for them to do the 2-room. Although I've had 5-year-olds come and the parent will just sit in the room with the child, but not participate, but just be there. And that's enough to keep the child engaged. So we're able to make that work. So yeah, you just fill out the intake form. If you specifically want to see me, that you can request that, but and then the office gets in touch with you. And I can tell you that our wait list is nowhere near the wait list at Children's. I heard the wait list at Children's is now over a year or something. We're about, I want to say I'm booking at the end of December. So not that far out relative to trying to get into other places. So I hope I'm happy to work with any of you.
Great. Well, thank you again, Alissa, and thank you everyone for joining our webinar today. We appreciate your time, and certainly feel free to follow up with Alissa directly or myself. And again, thanks so much for joining us. Stay well.
Thank you.